Hello, and welcome to the overview of H.R.1 State and Local Impacts webinar. We're delighted that you're joining us for the kickoff of BEA Foundation's State and Local Playbook webinar series. And a big thank you to our partners joining us today, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities and the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. And thank you, too, to our Policy Director, Olivia Nutter, for her leadership on this series and on all of our policy efforts. My name is Samantha Tweedy, and I'm the CEO of the Black Economic Alliance. For those of you new to BEA, we were founded by some of the nation's foremost Black business leaders who came together around a singular purpose. How do we leverage the influence, the resources, the networks, the business acumen of the Black business community to advance work, wages, and wealth across the entire Black community, and in so doing, grow the entire United States economy overall? BEA Foundation combines our power to convene America's top leaders across business, government, and philanthropy, our collective vision, our research-backed solutions, and cross-sector national partnerships to catalyze and to scale bold ideas. And we have long identified state and local solutions as a pathway to expanding Black economic opportunity, prosperity, and wealth building. With nearly 60% of Black Americans living in just 16 states and over a third of US Black population calling just 10 metropolitan areas home, we've long known that solutions that work for local communities and frontline governing executives are critical. And this reality has only become more and more important in this time of deep retrenchment of equal opportunity for economic security, mobility, and prosperity at the federal level. That's why, over the past year, we successfully uplifted the uniquely important role of state and local leaders with our Architects of Change initiative and the release of BEA Foundation's State and Local Playbook in September 2025. Together, this body of work serves as a call to action for increased investment and engagement and progress at the state and local level. Our goal remains the same: leverage the unique power of collaboration across business, government, and philanthropy to drive adoption of data-backed solutions that expand Black work, wages, and wealth, and in turn, grow the US economy as a whole. Now, to talk more about our playbook, introduce our speakers, and to lead our conversation today, I'm pleased to introduce our Director of Policy and Special Initiatives at BEA, Olivia Nutter. Over to you, Olivia.
Thank you, Samantha. As she mentioned, my name is Olivia Nutter, and I am BEA's Director of Policy and Special Initiatives. Like Samantha, I am so happy that you've decided to join us today. BEA Foundation's State and Local Playbook is a practical guide that offers state and local leaders policy recommendations, implementation strategies, and funding considerations for the solutions that strengthen local economies and fuel Black economic progress. Importantly, for both today's topic and the actual actionability of the document itself, we developed it while the debate around H.R.1 was ongoing. This allowed us to actually know the likely budget environment state and local leaders were going to be operating in and really design something around that. So, if the playbook was quite literally made for this moment. That's why, as we launch BEA Foundation State and Local Playbook webinar series, we are first focusing on those impacts of H.R.1 and what those will do for the state and local budgets. As I've alluded to, this is just the start. We will be convening virtually throughout the year to spread awareness and share guidance from practitioners that are implementing the best-in-class solutions that are in the playbook. So please stay tuned for more information to come on that series. Now, before I kick it over to the real experts, I want to go over some housekeeping items. This program is closed to the press and it is being recorded. Given the size of the room, all of your lines will be muted so that the presentations are not interrupted. You should notice a Q&A box toward the bottom of the Zoom window. You are able to submit questions throughout the presentations, but they will not be answered toward the end of the webinar. Questions you submit will be visible to me and the speakers, but not to other attendees. Also, I'll note that the Q&A portion will not be recorded. Finally, toward the end of the webinar, we will ask you 3 quick questions to help us better tailor the content we deliver. And with that, I am very excited to pass things off to our first presenter, Kamalika Das. Over to you, Kamalika.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm Kamalika Das, and I'm ITAP, that's the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy's Local Policy Director. And for those of you who may not know, ITEP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan tax policy organization. We analyze tax and economic proposals and try to answer a simple question. When you're thinking about all of these different tax proposals, who benefits, who pays, and what does that mean for equity and sustainability? And that question just feels especially urgent right now because, in a very short period of time, federal policy has shifted dramatically. And those changes are going to ripple through every state, every local government. The federal bill, H.R.1, is adding about $4 trillion to the national debt over the next decade, nearly $570 billion in 2026 alone, compared to what would have happened if Congress did nothing. And it manages to do this while enormously cutting back on federal support in so many big areas: healthcare, food assistance, environmental protection, and in many cases, expecting states to pick up the slack. But of course, as you know, states don't have the luxury of running up trillions of dollars in debt like the federal government. It's difficult to talk about a plus side when we know over 2.2 million people are going to lose health coverage this year. Over 3.2 million people are expected to lose SNAP benefits, countless other ramifications. But that said, there is a silver lining in the sense that it opens the door for more progressive revenue raising at the state and local level, because there's a general understanding that any targeted surtaxes on high earners and corporations just helps balance the scales. And it's simply taking back some of the very large federal tax cuts that they're enjoying right now. And I do mean some because the new Trump tax cuts are so generous to big corporations and a lot of hedge fund millionaires that even the more ambitious proposals would only offset a fraction of those windfalls, but they would lessen the harm. So here's a quick image. It just shows the fallout from the federal bill, which imposes new costs on state and local governments. And just to be clear, many states and localities were already struggling with a lot of rising costs, such as increased pension liabilities and healthcare, as well as reduced commercial real estate revenues following the pandemic. And so every state and local government is facing a lot of these tough fiscal choices right now. The situation is worse in some states than others because, again, to be clear, in some states, the budget crises aren't solely because of federal decisions. An alarming number of states really doubled down on regressive state policy choices like income tax cuts that primarily benefit wealthier households, a lot of huge private school voucher programs, and property tax cuts and caps. So in 2025 alone, 25 states created or expanded voucher programs, just as an example. So it's that combination of both the damaging federal and state policy changes that policymakers are dealing with today. I'm not going to rehash every provision in the bill, but there's a huge array of tax cuts and a much shorter list of tax increases. The changes with the biggest impacts are the rate and bracket changes, the qualified business income pass-through deduction, which is a tax subsidy for wealthy business owners who aren't subject to the corporate income tax, and various business tax breaks. So each of those changes alone would cut taxes for the average 1% family or household by $30,000 to $38,000 on average this year alone. So this really shows just kind of how different the impacts will be based on income group. So you could see the left side is your lowest earners, that bottom 20%, then it goes to second 20, middle 20, and then all the way on the right here, that's your top 0.1%. So it just goes kind of lowest income to highest income. And if you look at it really goes to show you how regressive it is. And that's a technical term. It's not a political one, because you can see the slope of the line, because the people who are benefiting the most are the people who are the wealthiest. We also have state-specific versions of this chart on our website, in case you find that helpful. So, on the left side, that shows the tax cuts relative to income. And on the right, you can see what that means in terms of actual dollars. A few statistics here. The richest 5% alone will receive 45% of the net tax cuts, and more than 70% will go to the richest fifth of Americans. If you account for tariffs, eliminating the healthcare premium tax credits, it's actually a tax increase on everyone except the richest 5%. I don't have that chart here, but it is on our website. And so, really, state lawmakers right now have this clear opportunity to step up and lead and to steer public policy back in a direction that aligns with what most people actually want. So, what does that look like in practice? It's twofold. One is that state legislators shouldn't feel obligated to piggyback on all of these changes that Congress just passed. That's that idea of conformity. And second, they can be more proactive, like enacting these progressive tax measures, which will only become more important as we start to see the real on the ground ramifications of Medicaid and SNAP cuts. So this is something that ITEP has been deeply focused on right now. This idea of decoupling, which really just means not automatically following the same changes as the federal government and being really thoughtful about what works for each state. And these decisions around tax conformity affect budgets for years to come, because once you decide, and there are different like levels of conforming, but once that's decided, it's going to just have like years and years of ramifications. So it's really crucial to get this right. So if the different states were to conform to each of these provisions that I listed right here, they would just lose billions of dollars in revenue that could otherwise be funding education, healthcare, other services. Don't need to go into all of them, but they include like loosening the cap on how much interest on loans can be deducted. There's like a really big, costly tax break for wealthy venture capitalists. There are also some provisions that make it easier for corporations to avoid taxes when they buy up equipment, build factories, and then a few other ones as well. But just wanted to give some examples of which ones make the most sense to decouple from. And just to kind of show the dollar value, a lot of states just can't afford to stay coupled. And it's also worth pointing out that every single state has decoupled from at least one aspect of the federal tax code in history. This isn't a new thing, it's not radical. Recently, Congress voted to stop DC from decoupling from a lot of the provisions, which is just really fascinating because a lot of the legislators who voted for that, live in states where they've actually decided to decouple themselves. And so currently, I think it's actually 9, like we're on the path to 10 states that have actively decoupled from at least some of these specific provisions. So you can see just how huge these revenue losses would be if they weren't going to decouple from the business tax breaks. In Michigan, over $500 million. You can just, yeah, it's a really large amount in every state. So there are different paths that they can take. If states don't automatically adopt federal definitions of taxable income, then they aren't actually required to adopt a lot of the new deductions, like the deductions on tips, overtime, car loan interest. And many tax policy experts recommend foregoing those. I think they sound really appealing on the campaign trail. They sound like it makes sense or that it benefits lower income folks, but it brings up a lot of issues. Like for instance, like on tips and overtime, why should bartenders pay less in taxes than low-paid childcare providers? It just violates a lot of basic tax neutrality principles. Um, and then there are things, just to be really clear, that there are a couple things in the bill that we think are worthwhile, like expanding these dependent care credits and some business tax changes that limit CEO pay deductions. So there, there are some things that we think of as positive. And I also want to point out that delinking isn't really a partisan issue, that these quotes reflect some of the debate in South Carolina. So, South Carolina, there are a lot of folks who are saying, like, we don't need to depend on the whims of the federal government, that we need to think through and figure out if these make sense, and make our policy based on South Carolina-centric tax policy that supports our budget. But here's the good news. There are states that are leaning into policies like millionaires' taxes, clamping down on corporate tax avoidance, as you can see from these screenshots. And I'll go into some of those examples a bit more. So the second decision after conformity is whether states should be going further. So not just avoiding the harmful federal provisions, but then to what extent should they be proactively strengthening their own revenue systems? It's actually a really interesting time because some state leaders who'd been very hesitant about raising revenue in the past are starting to be more open to it because I think they understand how deep the need is right now. And this is definitely true in Rhode Island and Washington, where the governors had been more hesitant to support high earner taxes, but are now, much more open to it. And then, Hawaii isn't on this list, but it's also an interesting example of a place where they had passed a lot of tax cuts for the wealthy that they're in the process of rolling back through a 3-year freeze because they're realizing maybe it makes more sense to protect revenue right now. And so here's some examples of different proposals. Like in Michigan, they're gathering signatures right now. I think Virginia is really interesting. I think the one that's here hasn't necessarily moved, but there are other proposals. There's a budget. There's the Senate budget is potentially eliminating a sales tax exemption for data centers, which would raise $1 billion over 2 years. And it's interesting to kind of compare that to some of the other states. Like in West Virginia, the Senate approved a 10% income tax cut at the same time. There are also a handful of states that are thinking about something called wealth proceeds taxes, which tax income from passive investments like interest and stock dividends and capital gains, as opposed to income from work. So as I said earlier, local revenue declines are pretty common right now. The fallout from the pandemic continues. And then there are a lot of localities are struggling with higher interest rates on debt, service payments, pension costs, construction costs, and so on. So in practical terms, this leads to reduced food assistance benefits, fewer dollars circulating through local stores, higher uncompensated care costs for county hospitals, and then cuts to just help public health, libraries, park, and road maintenance. Okay, so because of this, I think it's interesting to note that one sign of all of this interest are the numerous tax commissions and tax task forces that jurisdictions are setting up. These are from a couple of years ago, but there's some really great ideas. And I think it's interesting how many of these there have been. They're all throughout Pittsburgh, Scottsdale, Arizona, DC, Cincinnati, Salem, Oregon. And so they've been considering things like digital advertising taxes or, vacancy taxes, congestion pricing. There's just a lot more creativity right now. And at the local level, yeah, like I said, we're seeing this mix of creativity, constraint, in some cases, more desperation on austerity measures. The truth is, a lot of cities and counties just don't have the same tools as states. They can't often levy local income taxes or wealth taxes at all. It really depends on the locality. So, in some places, we are seeing progressive business taxes or higher taxes on large corporations and high income residents. Seattle's a good example of that. They have this new thing called a Seattle Shield initiative. But what, unfortunately, like one thing that we are seeing is that the local officials might be interested in doing it, but a lot of states won't necessarily let them. And so many states and counties, they're trying to rely on these local option taxes, but there's just a lot of legislation and preemption kind of holding them back. Um, so again, without help from the state level, a lot of local governments are kind of left between choosing different regressive options. But to leave this on a high note, it is really exciting to see so many different state and local legislators be interested in new forms of revenue. We have a lot more details on what those other options are on our website, and would definitely invite you to take a look at them. So thank you so much. Feel free to email me, and I'm going to turn it back to Olivia.
Thank you, Kamalika. As a reminder, any questions for her will be addressed after the next presentation. So up next, we have Whitney Jemison, and there she is.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Yes, again, my name is Whitney Jemison. I'm Director of State Fiscal Policy Research at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. For folks who are unaware, CBPP is a nonpartisan research institute based in Washington, D.C. that since 1981 has really advanced both federal and state policies aimed at building a nation where everyone has the resources that they need to thrive. I've been at the center for the past 5 years, but in this general line of work for over 12 now, focused primarily on the critical importance of state level tax and budget choices for people's everyday well-being. So I'm going to start by overviewing a little bit more of the context of recent federal actions that have really impacted a lot of state decision making based on what my team tracks across the country. In general, right now, we are seeing that states and localities are navigating a really major fiscal transition. Pandemic era emergency funding is winding down, federal program rules and reporting are shifting, and new federal appropriations and policy decisions are really changing the baseline for state budgets and services. That is creating both risk through sudden funding cliffs and opportunity, as Kamalika mentioned, in that there is new interest in revenue raisers that can really prove possible some of the investments that groups have been talking about for decades now in states, because states are in such a constrained revenue situation that there is new political will and interest in trying out some of those ideas. And I think that there's also opportunity right now to use one-time dollars that states have really strategically to address some of the startup costs and initial costs that states are facing right now. So here I have listed some of those major buckets of expired or expiring federal funding. You all are probably already aware of many of these. H.R.1, the mega bill passed by congressional Republicans last July, is the biggest impact on state budgets right now, but it is just one of the multiple federal funding issues that states are facing today. So these are some of those other big buckets that were really serving as pillars of state level policymaking up until about last year. And now states are not only without that funding, but are seeing new cuts to programs and services that they have tended to rely on the federal government for support on over several decades now, and trying out new things to try and fill the gap. And as Kamalika touched on, that gap is huge. Um, the bottom line is that HR1 is raising costs on people and families, and it is going to remove health coverage and food assistance and some of these basic needs programs coverage away from many people who are already struggling to make ends meet. The bill does that while showering some really huge tax breaks on the wealthiest households. You can see here that just the cuts to ACA marketplace coverage and to Medicaid are accounting for, and the cuts to SNAP are accounting for just the tax cuts for people with incomes over $500,000, which is not at all of the tax cuts included in that bill. But it is a pretty clear handoff, right? That the federal government has essentially saved well over $1 trillion by cutting people off of Medicaid and SNAP, and uses that money to then cut taxes for households with high incomes. That decision has massive impacts not only on state budgets, but also local budgets as well, because localities are in charge of administering many of the programs and services that are now facing these major cuts. So HR1 started out as a set of ideas at the national level, but now it is a set of choices that are facing states and localities. The really massive cost shifts from the federal government down to states and localities is the backdrop for everything else that I'm going to share today, because there is no state that is totally immune from these effects. And the debate over how to balance state budgets is now the primary debate in every state. Essentially, states that want people to be able to keep their health coverage and food assistance as it was before HR1 are going to have to pay a lot more to do that, whether their budgets are primed for it or not. Because unlike Congress, states have to balance their budgets. So cuts to federal support, along with all the new costs that were included in that bill, mean that they are facing really painful trade-offs right now. They can either raise new revenues to offset the cost, make harmful benefit or eligibility cuts to various basic needs programs, or shift state funds from other priorities. Here I've listed out some of the major timeline points related to HR1 that are going to be hitting state budgets and subsequently local budgets as well. Right now, we are already seeing states take actions to try and minimize their SNAP payment error rates. As was noted on the previous slide, states are now going to be responsible for covering a portion of SNAP benefits, in addition to seeing SNAP administrative costs go up, which you'll see under October 2026 there. But those SNAP benefit costs are based on states' payment error rates, which is related to states' over and under payments of people, not based on individual behaviors of folks who are receiving those program benefits. But states are now doing a lot of work to try and shore up administrative capacity to try and minimize error rates moving forward, so that when that SNAP cost shift goes into effect, they will pay lower rates. Any states that have cost shifts over 6% are going to be paying millions of additional dollars each year. Now, significant cuts in federal support would create considerable pressure for states at any time because of the longstanding role that federal funding plays in states' overall budgets. But federal funds currently account for about one in every $3 that are spent in states. And that level has been fairly consistent over the past few decades. But that means that budget trade-offs are especially hard in states right now, given that state finances have already been showing increasing signs of strain. And things obviously would only worsen if the economy were to tip towards recession. Some major factors impacting that strain are up on the slide here. So first, states have really just gone on a tax cutting spree since 2021, enacting a wave of oftentimes very large, very costly income tax cuts in the wake of COVID-19 and the unexpectedly strong economic recovery that followed it, which was also due in large part to the historic federal aid response to states then. But from 2021 to 2025, 26 different states cut their personal or corporate income tax rates. 21 of them did so multiple times, and 9 states enacted cuts 3 different times. And in 3 states, Arkansas, Idaho, and Utah, they did so 4 times. And so they used this temporary influx of funding to justify permanent cuts to their income taxes, which has created really structural income tax issues in many states now, as their budgets are even further strained by the new pressures from HR1. Secondly, there is a new and rapidly increasing trend of revenue reductions for public education, specifically through a proliferation of local property tax cuts and caps, and a surge of new private school voucher programs at the state level. And so 18 states have now enacted universal or near universal private school choice programs, including vouchers, education savings accounts, ESAs, you might have heard of them, tax credit scholarships, all of those. Despite the fact that in most states, voucher recipient families were already affording private schools. So that's additional money from state general funds that is now not going toward public education, but toward all families, including those that were already paying for private education. in conjunction with the property tax cuts and caps that are being proposed and enacted across the country, largely in response to the affordability crisis, right? We're seeing that public education is under serious, significant threat right now. And most states haven't really come up with a plan to try and slow this, besides just reversing choices that have already been made over the past 3 to 4 years. And I also mentioned that pandemic era federal fiscal aid is slowing down, but we are also seeing that revenue collections in states have just been stabilizing after the post COVID boom. And so they are now at or below historic norms in most states. And so there is a real need to come up with new ways to bring in funding that is going to allow states to make the investments that they need to meet everyone's needs. Erratic economic policy setting from the Trump administration is also not really helping, as localities are really trying to make decisions. Businesses across the country are really paralyzed by a lot of the tariff policy that has been changing, even as recently as this week. And so we are seeing that there's weakening consumer confidence across the economy. And the Congressional Budget Office forecast for the 2025 economy shifted between January 2025 and September 2025, such that real GDP went down from 1.9% to 1.4. Inflation went up from 2.2% to 3.1. Unemployment went up from 4.3% to 4.5%, and that's for all unemployment for all workers. And H.R.1's changes to the social safety net are also likely to make it less effective in any future downturn. So states and localities have to be more prepared on their own to try and weather any economic storms that are on the way. We are likely to see debt and deficits rise if a recession comes. Black workers are really the proverbial canary in a coal mine on this point. States and localities that have a particularly high proportion of Black workers have to be especially prepared for economic downturn because Black workers tend to feel the effects of these hardening economic conditions much more quickly than other workers. While I mentioned that the overall unemployment rate last year went up to 4.5%, for Black workers, it was much closer to 8%. Right. And so we're seeing a sort of accelerated timeline that needs to be followed in states and especially localities with really high proportions of Black families and Black workers. So what are states doing right now? These are a few trends and some challenges that my team has picked up on, but there are obviously lots of activities going on. Kamalika touched on some of them, and we can discuss more in Q&A. But overall, these are some trends that we've seen. First, just updated forecasting. States are making changes to their revenue forecasts to try and allow themselves to weather the storm, and also using reserve funds or reallocations, funds specifically for certain population groups to try and fill in the gaps. So for states that have additional revenue, I think that that is a good option. And many states are still sitting on pretty high rainy day funds. And so this allows for an opportunity for them to really make those investments in one-time needs. Like administrative costs to try and make their SNAP programs more efficient at processing new people who are applying for the program, right? Basic needs programs, cuts, and restrictions are also just on the rise across the country. Many states have been making cuts to their Medicaid programs, restricting eligibility for SNAP already, not only in an effort to keep costs low, but also because those changes are likely to kick people off of the programs and thus reduce costs. Right. Tax decoupling, as Kamalika mentioned, and then also revenue raising. I noted the doubling down on tax cuts because there are states that are making some choices that are going to make this worse over time. But we are seeing a real divide in the states that is becoming just more and more political about whether they make those choices now, right? To either raise new revenues or to try and double down on their tax cuts. And I think how that's going to play out will be seen over the next few months to a year. Few other issues to watch. We are seeing a trend of some actors in states pushing model bills to codify Medicaid and SNAP requirements that are harsher even than what was in H.R.1. So I think that that is something to keep an eye on. As those things become standardized into state constitutions, for example, like a ballot initiative in Missouri is proposing, it will make it really hard for states to be able to meet rising costs over time. Um, Federal data availability is also an issue right now, and disaster management is problematic as the federal government has pulled back on a lot of disaster funding as well. So those are issues that are getting a little bit less press coverage, but things that I do encourage you to keep an eye on. And then for the what you can do about it, Kamalika touched on this, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but my high level recommendations are first to focus on revenue. Cuts are really getting a lot of shine right now, but revenue is really important for states to have stability over the long term, and in turn for them to be able to enact lots of different things on the local level that then could create precedent and create new ideas for states. We really have to not turn away from the opportunity that faces localities and states right now to raise new revenues. You could do that through a few different ways that I've put up here on the slide. Decoupling from those really costly federal tax breaks is one, but also, refusing to enact additional cuts, pausing or rolling back recently enacted cuts, as they've done in Hawaii, as some cuts have been proposed to be rolled back in North Carolina, or raising new revenues through some of the means that Kamalika mentioned. There are lots of options here. So you could use the QR code on this slide to pull up our state and local revenue options menu from CBPP. Here you can see by state what sort of revenue raisers we recommend and what is possible in your state based on structural barriers that you may have in your constitution or elsewhere. And then also just recommend budgeting for tomorrow, focusing on obligations that build capacity, that reduce recurring costs, administrative supports right now, employing one-time funds for strategic capital, for startup funds, not using them as justification for additional tax cuts, as has happened over the past 5 years and has really put states in a really dire position right now. And then also continue to monitor litigation and federal rulemaking as things are changing every single day. And to help you with that, I just recommend reaching out to an organization in the State Priorities Partnership. This is a partnership that the Center on Budget and Policies Priorities supports. We have partners in 42 states and also DC and Puerto Rico who are local experts on the tax and budget system in your state, and who can help you understand not only the impacts of federal actions, but also what options make the most sense for your state's fiscal context. And we at the center provide additional technical support to those groups as well, along with ITEP. So we are kind of working in a unified way to provide additional supports as you need them. And you can see here on this map, all the parts in dark blue are states where there is an SPP partner that I could help to connect you with. All right, and then this is my contact information, so please be in touch if you have additional questions. Thank you.
Another big thank you to Kamalika and Whitney. Huge thank you to the folks who have joined us today. We hope that you found this information helpful. And quite frankly, hope even more that it sparks some next steps for you or your organization in terms of collective action that will really address what we heard today. And with that, I'll let y'all go about your day.